Rainy alone at night. Horror stories. The sound of rain pattered softly against the window pane as Emma sat alone in her tiny cabin, nestled deep within the woods. She had always enjoyed the sound of rain. It was soothing, a constant rhythm that often lulled her to sleep. But tonight, the rain carried an unfamiliar weight, a heaviness that pressed against her chest and made her feel more isolated than ever. The cabin had been a last-minute retreat, a decision made after months of work stress and personal turmoil. Emma's therapist suggested she take time to unplug, and a week away from the chaos of the city had seemed like the perfect idea. The cabin was far enough from civilization to be peaceful, but not so remote that it felt unsafe. At least, that's what she had thought when she booked it. Now, as the rain drummed on, the isolation felt different. The woods outside were pitch black, and the nearest neighbor was a mile away. There was no phone reception, and the Wi-Fi that had been promised was spotty at best. Emma hadn't planned on feeling this cut off, this alone. The thought flickered through her mind as she glanced at the small fire crackling in the hearth, its glow casting eerie shadows across the room. Her eyes drifted toward the clock on the mantelpiece. It was just past midnight. She hadn't been able to sleep despite the long day of hiking and exploring. Something gnawed at her, a subtle but persistent feeling of unease that she couldn't shake. She stood up and walked to the window, parting the curtains just slightly. Outside, the rain poured down in torrents, making it impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the porch. The forest seemed to melt into a wall of blackness, the rain like a thick curtain hiding whatever lay beyond. She told herself that the woods were empty, that there was nothing out there but trees and animals. Yet a strange sensation crawled up her spine as if something, or someone, was watching her from just beyond the darkness. Emma quickly shut the curtains and took a deep breath. She was letting her imagination get the better of her. After all, she had spent most of her life in a bustling city, where the constant noise of traffic and people filled every silent moment. Here, the silence was deafening, broken only by the rain and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. She returned to the couch, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. A storm was coming, according to the forecast she had checked earlier, and the rain had only just begun. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, rattling the cabin's windows. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire and the soft hiss of the flames. Then she heard it, a faint tap, a light rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the back door. At first, Emma thought it was just the wind or a tree branch brushing against the cabin, but the tapping continued, deliberate and steady. She sat up, her heart quickening. Probably just the wind, she muttered to herself, though the reassurance felt hollow. She strained her ears, trying to ignore the pounding rain and gusts of wind. The tapping stopped. Silence. She let out a slow breath, relieved. But then, the tapping started again. Closer this time. Emma froze. The sound was unmistakable now, a soft but clear knock on the back door. She had locked all the doors when she arrived, hadn't she? She was sure she had. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Whoever, or whatever, was at the door wasn't leaving. Summoning her courage, Emma stood up, clutching her phone in one hand, even though she knew it wouldn't help. She tiptoed across the wooden floor, her footsteps barely making a sound over the din of the rain. The back door was just around the corner, out of sight from where she had been sitting. She hesitated. Every instinct told her not to open it. Her heart raced, the pulse throbbing in her ears. The knocking grew louder, now accompanied by a faint voice, soft, distant, and almost pleading. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Emma's breath caught in her throat. The voice sounded weak, desperate, but there was something wrong with it, something off that she couldn't quite place. It was as though the words were being stretched, warped slightly by the wind and rain. She pressed her ear to the door, trying to listen. The voice called out again, closer this time. "Please, let me in." Emma's hand hovered over the doorknob, her mind racing. She didn't want to leave whoever it was out there in the storm, but everything about the situation felt wrong. The voice didn't sound human. It was too hollow, too far away, even though it seemed to be just on the other side of the door. With a trembling hand, she backed away, stepping lightly so the floor wouldn't creak beneath her weight. She decided to wait it out. Whoever it was could leave, or maybe she'd convince herself in the morning that it had all been some figment of her imagination, conjured by the isolation and the rain. But the knocking grew more frantic, more persistent. "Please, let me in!" Now it sounded as though multiple voices were pleading. Emma's chest tightened as a feeling of cold dread spread through her. She had read stories about things that mimicked human voices, creatures that lived in the woods and lured people in by pretending to need help. She bolted back to the living room, her mind racing. She grabbed the poker from the fireplace and stood still, listening. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. The rain continued to pound against the cabin, but the voices were gone. A thin, cold breeze seeped through the cracks around the windows, and Emma felt a chill run through her bones. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. Soft, careful footsteps coming from inside the house. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she turned slowly, eyes wide with fear. The footsteps were coming from the hallway that led to the back door. The shadows seemed to shift, moving as though something was lurking just out of sight. Emma gripped the poker tighter, her knuckles white. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until she could hear them just behind her. She spun around, raising the poker above her head, ready to strike. But there was nothing. No one stood behind her. She backed up, her heart pounding in her chest, every nerve in her body on edge. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the crackling of the fire. She took a shaky breath, trying to calm herself. Maybe she was imagining it all. Maybe the isolation and the storm were playing tricks on her mind. But then, in the flickering firelight, she saw it. A figure, pale, gaunt, and barely visible in the shadows. It stood at the far end of the room, watching her with eyes that were nothing but hollow sockets. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth was open in a soundless scream. Emma screamed, stumbling backward, her heart racing with terror. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the room, suffocating her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She bolted for the door, flinging it open and running out into the rain without looking back. The cold rain drenched her instantly as she sprinted through the woods, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop, didn't look behind her, not until she was halfway down the road that led back to the town. Only then did she glance back. Through the sheets of rain, she could see the cabin. Its windows were dark, but she could still feel it, the presence, watching her, waiting for her to return. It wasn't finished with her. Not yet. The storm raged on, but the rain could no longer drown out the sound of the voices, calling to her from the woods, begging her to come back.